Good morning, everybody. We're glad you're with us. Tim Andersen here, the Appraiser's Advocate. And we have as our guest this morning, Mr. Craig Morley. Craig, how are you?
Doing very well, thank you.
Good. Craig, I'm glad to hear it. And we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. But before we do, we have to put out a couple of caveats. Now, Craig, if ever there was an authority on real estate appraisal, Craig Morley is that authority. Craig is the former chair of the Utah Appraisal Authority, and he consults with them now. He works with the realtors in Utah, the appraisal coalitions in Utah. He's on NAR's appraisal section. He's the former president of the National Association of Appraisers. And right now, he is a sitting member of the Appraisal Standards Board. However, and there's always a however, Craig is not here today in any of those capacities. He's here as just Craig and a knowledgeable expert in the things of real estate. But again, what he says are not official pronouncements from any of those authorities. It's just Craig and I asking questions and stating answers. So, Craig, now that we've got the legal stuff out of the way, let's get to the important stuff. So, the last time we were chatting, you were talking about in your office, and you practice in 3 states, Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. In your offices, you have seen refinancing, especially residential refinancing, drop. Now, I got a phone call last night from a friend of mine. He's a commercial appraiser. He lives down in the Florida Keys, but he works all over the state. And he has said he has seen commercially refinancing drop significantly. What's your take on that?
Well, we have seen, and you'd have to pretty much be living in a cave not to realize that interest rates have about doubled in the last couple of months. And with that significant increase in mortgage interest rates, it has really curtailed the economic viability of refinancing your property. I was talking to a mortgage broker a couple of days ago, and he said he's still getting a few refinance loan applications coming in, but they generally represent people who have debt that they're trying to consolidate or something else. But the vast majority of people who could have refinanced already have. And so the mortgage brokers I've talked to indicate that their workload has dropped by anywhere from 50 to 60%, which means that obviously they aren't engaging appraisers to perform appraisals on those loan applications that they're taking. And I think many appraisers are beginning to see the impact of that increase in the interest rate.
Okay, so you just mentioned lack of refinancing. You just mentioned increase of interest rates. And then obviously appraisers are seeing less work. Given the increase in interest rates, do you think that I'm going to ask you about numbers of sales and sales prices? Do you think the absolute volume of sales is going to drop? And do you think that sales prices are going to drop?
What we've seen so far, at least in most of the markets in which we're dealing, is there's been a increase in inventory, which is good news for the buyers, I guess. The bad news for the buyers is the cost of money is so much higher that you would have to see a fairly significant increase or decrease in the purchase price to maintain the purchasing power that you had a couple of months ago. The inventory, with the increasing inventory, we've seen a direct correlation with housing pricing. Now, in our market, the market's been very, very strong. And so we haven't seen prices decline, but we have most certainly seen the marketing time is being extended. It's taking much longer to get homes under contract. And I've got a couple of boys that have their real estate license and are selling real estate. And There's a buyer psychology or a seller psychology where you've heard about your neighbor across the street that put their house on the market and had it sold higher than anything else in the neighborhood within a day or two. That is not happening, at least in our market. And I think across the country, as the inventories increase, it's certainly putting the brakes on the rate of increase. And in some markets, you're beginning to see some of those prices stabilize and decrease depending on which market you're in. But I think the other aspect of that is the volume of sales is declining, if for no other reason that someone who could qualify to buy a $500,000 home a few months ago may not be able to qualify for that same home today because the payments have gone up as much as 20-25% with the increase in the interest rates. So it's creating some problems from an affordability standpoint that even if the price has not changed, if I'm not a cash buyer, the cost of purchasing the property from a monthly payment standpoint is much higher, and it's disqualifying some of those buyers who could purchase a home a few months ago cannot. And we are beginning to see now, part of the challenge we run into in our local market is we go through seasonal fluctuations on sales activity. In our area, it's hot, and summer tends to be a little bit slower than in the fall. And so we might, it may be a little bit of a seasonal fluctuation, but the reality is the sales volume has dropped off a little bit as well.
Okay, sales volume has dropped off. Let's relate what you have just said to the boots on the ground appraiser. You indicated that properties are coming on the market, and instead of being bid up, go under contract in 12 hours, this is lasting, or they're on the market much longer. Therefore, we are seeing longer exposure times. What does a longer exposure time mean for the typical appraiser? For example, a comparable sale that literally was put on the market at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at noon a contract came in, and at 2 a higher contract, and at 4 a higher contract came in. So the days on market could be either called 0 or 1. But now that this is not the norm, or excuse me, now that people are not in such a buying frenzy, how is the appraiser going to account for the difference in markets between putting a property on the market and getting multiple bids and putting a property on the market and getting nothing?
I think the key from my perspective is that we've got to be taking a closer look at your listing inventories. As appraisers, we tend to focus a great deal on sales activity and the sales that have taken place, and try to make the market adjustments to reflect those differences between the sales price and what we think the differences are between that property and the property that's being appraised. But I think it becomes pretty important at this point to start looking at the listing inventories. How many properties are available for sale that are competitive with this property? And how is that going to impact the value of the property from a market value perspective? The other issue that we may have, and this becomes, in a perfect world, we love these really simple little formulas where we can say, yeah, it's going up at X% a month, and if I use a sale that is 4 or 5 months old, I can apply that adjustment and have a degree of confidence that that's going to accurately reflect the market. We may be getting in some markets where if I'm using a little bit older sale, something that sold 6-7 months ago, I might have seen increases in value over the first quarter of the year, but I might see nothing or perhaps a decline in the second quarter. And so we've really got to be dialed in to the to the market, so that as we use these sales as comparable sales and try to appropriately reflect the changing market conditions, that we're reflecting reality rather than some formula that we've heard or seen or maybe developed from some model that may not reflect the reality of what's going on. And I really think the inventory, the listing, helps tell the tale on which direction we're going and how we ought to appropriately analyze the markets within which we're appraising.
Okay, Craig, let's talk about affordability. Now, you mentioned that a few minutes ago. So, and this is a totally hypothetical situation. Somebody pays $500,000 for a house after they bid it up from the $450,000 listing price, and they got a mortgage at 3.5%. Okay, they're happy with it. Now, interest rates have gone up. Nobody debates that. Now, this person who very possibly may have overpaid for the house now wants to refinance, and interest rates are now closer to 6%, basically a 100% increase. And the appraiser comes out, and the appraiser does his or her thing, and the appraiser comes out and says, well, Mr. and Mrs. Home Refinancer, you probably overpaid for your house. And given the fact that interest rates have gone up and people have slowed down and properties are on the market more often, your property is worth $425,000. In other words, they're underwater. Now, two questions based on that. Do you see that as a potential scenario? And do you see that as a potential not only for complaints against appraisers, but for lawsuits against appraisers?
The reality is that we have been through markets where you've seen property prices decline. And typically, I mean, if you've been in the business long enough, you begin to notice that there's market cycles where, anecdotally, I mean, typically it's about a 10-year cycle. This last cycle's been longer than that by quite a bit. But as you would come in and watch these market cycles, prices would go up, and then you'd see a slight adjustment. Prices would come down a little bit, then they'd go back up again. And it's kind of a stair-stepping kind of a market trend. When we saw the last decline, the decline in many segments of the market was huge. It was catastrophic in some markets, where you'd see prices decline from the peak in like 2006 down to as low as 50% or more in some areas in 2011 and 12. And so that was a dramatic market swing. And as we dug out of that hole, and I'm thinking, we do work in the Las Vegas market where it was particularly hard hit, but that market has recovered and has exceeded by a fair bit the highs of 2006. There's some fairly significant differences in the market dynamics this go around from what there has been in the past, because in 2006 there was a lot of hype and not a lot of end users for the properties. People were buying things on the speculative basis that I'm just going to go resell the property and make money, but they didn't have users for the homes. We still have a housing shortage in the US right now, and so there are still buyers looking to buy property. But at some point, we are finding situations where the price point has raised to such a level that it's excluding many of the would-be occupants of these homes simply because of the price. And now with the double impact of the increasing interest rates, it's putting many of these properties out of reach for many buyers. And so, yeah, I think it's very likely that you're going to see some of these areas where you've had a large degree or a large amount of new construction or other homes that have come on the market where there's going to be some downward pressure. And you're very likely to see some of these properties be coming in lower than what they were before. as an appraiser, I think the key that I would be doing in that scenario is to make sure I'm very careful in explaining what I did, what was the search criteria that I used, uh, and and do a careful job of analyzing the sales so that I can explain within the body of the report what my assignment results were and why. I think where we run into problems is we get in a hurry and we don't thoroughly explain what our results were and why. And when we don't do that, it leaves questions in the consumer's mind. And even though the borrower may not be an intended user, they are certainly the ones who seem to have the most at risk. And if they're unhappy with the results, which oftentimes they are, uh, the appraiser may be the target that they're going to be pointing at when they want to express their frustration in not being able to meet their life goals and needs. And so I think the situation that you posed is certainly possible. And I think as appraisers, we need to do a very good job of reconciling our conclusions so that people can understand why their property has declined in value from what they've paid for it, with compelling data and really good, clear logic.
All right, let's continue on that thought. So, all right, you're sitting at your desk, and it's a house sold 18 months ago, and at a 2.5% mortgage, and it sold for round numbers $500,000. You didn't appraise it; somebody else did, but now you're getting the request to go appraise the property, and you look in MLS, and you talk to brokers, and you do all the things you're supposed to do, and you find out that, yeah, that house has gone down in value, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, I really better get this one nailed down, because if I don't, this one's going to come back to bite me. And what I'm leading up to is, given this change in the economy, given this change in buyer profiles, given this change in differences in the ability to finance a property, you probably won't have to put any more down, but your money is going to buy less house because the interest rate is higher. So where I'm going with this is simply, can appraisers continue business as usual, given these changes in scenarios, or are appraisers going to have to be a lot more careful, dare I say it, a lot more professional in amassing, verifying, and analyzing data, or are we just going to keep going on like we have in the past?
Well, in a perfect world, we would be doing all of those careful analysis and writing uh, carefully worded reconciliations, regardless of what the market's doing. But it seems like you're more likely to have complaints filed when you see changing market conditions down. It's pretty frustrating for people that just bought a home not long ago, and to have that appraisal come in lower than what they paid for it is certainly going to raise questions. And so I think to there's nothing you can do to avoid people complaining and sending in complaints, but you can certainly make sure that you've done a good job in your analysis and reconciliation when in putting your report together. And clearly a good work file, good analysis, and good reconciliation is always the best formula to protect yourself against frivolous complaints that come in from unhappy buyers or excuse me, unhappy borrowers.
Continuing in that vein, in the same scenario that I just set up, you do the appraisal, you're very happy with the quality and quantity of your work, and you send the appraisal into the lender, and they paid 500, and you just said it's worth 4.5. Okay, now obviously the borrower is going to be upset. Why is the borrower upset with you rather than with the appraiser, who potentially appraised it too high in the first place? Because the appraiser did not take into account, did not adjust for the frenzy of buying that was going on. And indeed, the $500,000 was $25,000 over the original listing price. Now, you've got nothing to do with that, but is that first appraiser going to share any of the blame? And how, if at all, can appraisers account for these buying frenzies, knowing full well that they're going to go away in the future?
Well, I think, it's kind of a difficult situation that we find ourselves in both the buying frenzy and then the adjusting market. If I've got good data that tells me that, yeah, they paid more. In fact, one of the things that's interesting is you talk to many of the real estate marketing folks, one of the strategies that they will employ in selling a property in a really hot market is to price it below what they think they can sell it for and try to obtain multiple offers and create kind of this bidding war. And I've talked to a number of agents where that's been the strategy is they list it below what they think they can sell, but it becomes such a good buy that you've got all kinds of people making offers, and then they will say, okay, we're ready for the highest and best, give me your best offer, and you will see the property sell for more, sometimes significantly more than the original ask price. As an appraiser, it's probably good for me to understand that that was a marketing strategy rather than it was a fluky situation where I just had somebody who had to have the property and they paid whatever they had to get it without really additional market support for that. So the appraiser who's appraising that property where it's selling above the list price needs to make sure there's good solid data to support your conclusions if that's what you conclude. And I think we have seen situations where, maybe the support for that higher price isn't what it ought to be. I think that appraiser who's appraised this property on the higher end, there's a possibility that a consumer could, a borrower could come in and say, hey, you did not accurately reflect the actual market value, and I want to seek damages because you led me to believe that this property was worth more than it actually is. That happens from time to time, but it seems to be rare. It seems to me to be more likely that the lender, once that property is foreclosed, is going to, the appraiser probably has more exposure from the lender than they do from the borrower in that situation. But, human nature is we like to be told that we're smart and that we like to have our thoughts and feelings ratified. So the guy who, and we've seen this in a lot of these complaints against racial bias, that the high appraisal is always the right one. And so I think realistically, human nature is most likely to be that the guy who comes in and appraises it lower in the market's perception is going to be the wrong, you're the wrong one. You did a bad job, when in fact it's very likely that they've done it just exactly the way they're supposed to.
All right. Again, let me follow up on that one as we wrap this up. So the house was listed at 475. There was a bidding war, and the highest offer that came in was $500,000. So the appraiser appraises it for the 5K. Now, is the appraiser confusing price and value? And how does the appraiser distinguish between price and value?
It is easy to confuse the two. And I know that as we look at that price, it's a piece of data that we need to reconcile with the overall market. I think the reality is that if we can determine that the price is consistent with the market value based on transactional data that's taken place, then no problem. But if we are finding that that price is outside the range, then we need to make sure that we're reporting what we believe the market value to be rather than ratifying a purchase price. Sometimes that can be a challenging situation, but yeah, I see a lot of contracts over this past year where one of the terms of the contract indicate that we will pay up to $20,000 over the appraised value. Whatever, the agent apparently is astute enough to recognize that I don't think this is going to appraise for what we're selling it for. So we want to make this offer appealing to a seller. And so they'll say, yeah, our appraisal contingency is that if it comes in within a dollar amount, and we've seen some of them have been pretty wide ranges, but then we will still purchase the property. And I think in many of those cases, it's more of a function of qualifying for the loan. I can come up with an extra 20 or 30,000, but I can't come up with more than that. And so we can purchase the property. And in these markets where there is an extreme shortage, in our market, we have, in our metro area, we have about 150,000 people. We've had times where there's been 400 homes or 400 residential properties of any kind on the market at any one time. The typical inventory has been 1,600. And so when it drops down to that point, there's just nothing for anyone to buy. And so if they find something, it's like, well, if I want a house, I've got to buy it. My options are kind of limited. And I think your appraisal has to reflect that fact that there's a very short inventory, but you have to recognize that when market conditions change and the prices begin to adjust and market values correspondingly adjust with those changing prices, that we don't live in a static world, and there's this idea that real estate values always go up, and that's just that's a false premise. We see them go up and we see them go down, and they're all based on market conditions, and supply and demand are one of those things that really kind of direct what's going to happen. So I think in the market in which we're currently dealing with, having a good handle on the overall inventory and that's out there, you can usually go do market statistics in an MLS. And ours, it's been really interesting to see, is that we can look at how many properties have had price adjustments. We can see the number, draw a graph that will show the inventory and the prices. And there's a direct correlation when we start looking at trend lines. As inventories go up, the prices start to flatten out. And we haven't seen them go down yet in our market, but it's certainly changing. And so I think the thing that I would be interested in doing as an appraiser is making sure that I'm using appropriate market analysis and market condition adjustments as I use these sales to try to reflect what the true market value of a property may be.
All right, Craig, let me ask one last question before we wrap this up. Now, we've been talking about changing markets, and you mentioned earlier that potentially the way appraisers have done things in the past is not going to work given those changes. Now, I'm sure that there are some appraisers out there who are saying, hey, for what I get for my typical fee for an appraisal, I can't go to that kind of work. So I'm just going to keep doing what I've done. Now, is that mindset going to help or hurt an appraiser if he or she winds up spending an afternoon with the state appraisal board?
Well, my experience is it's never a fun thing going to sit in front of the appraisal board. And, it's been an interesting experience as, you'd sit and preside over these hearings, and people come in confident that the work that they've done is stellar. There couldn't be, was anybody questioning what I've done? And they come out an hour or two later going, holy cow, I had no idea what my obligations were. And so, and interestingly, we would get some of them that would come up after and say, I think I've learned more in the last hour or two about appraising than I have in the last few years. And that's a tragic situation, I'm afraid. But I think a lot of times we don't know what we don't know. And so we think we're doing everything just perfectly correct. And we get into a critical review and discover that maybe our work product isn't what it ought to be. So I think as we start into this period of time where we're starting to see these changing markets, it's a really good time to sit down and look at, how am I reporting my assignment results? Do I need to update my comments? Do I need to update my templates? Do I need to make some changes in the things that I'm doing so that I'm not using neighborhood descriptions that incorrectly report market trends or other things? And, you know, am I doing work that's going to stand up to scrutiny? And then, as you've implied, Tim, is that the reality is the fee has nothing to do with the obligations that we have in performing the appraisal. Now, realistically, I think I'm hearing that there's fee pressure already because there's less work and the same number of appraisers. And so, you get these bidding opportunities and say, gee, it's this one or nothing. I guess I'm going to bid it cheap or cheaper than what I would have done it in the past. And that's fine. You can do whatever you want. But keep in mind that your obligation for the appraisal does not change simply because I decided to accept the assignment at a low fee. The obligations remain the same. And I think this same counsel applies to doing the desktop and the bifurcated and all of the others. Standard 1 doesn't change. Standard 2 doesn't change. Your obligations for record keeping and ethics and all of those things remain the same. And so you have to bake into your fee structure the cost of doing business. And you find sometimes that these cheap fees can be really expensive if it doesn't stand up to scrutiny and somebody's unhappy with the results and you've got to defend yourself in front of an enforcement agency.
I like that. Sometimes these cheap fees can be really expensive. I like that, Craig. Thank you very much. All right, well, Craig, we appreciate your time this morning. The viewers appreciate your time. We appreciate your wisdom. And anything else we need to be aware of?
Well, it's we have an AXCON, or not an AXCON, but the Appraisal Summit coming up in September. And so I think both you and I are planning to be there. And we would certainly invite anybody who wants to come out to Las Vegas and spend a little time getting some education, rubbing shoulders with some of the people in the appraisal industry. Great opportunity to do that. And gee, if work slows down, maybe it's a good time to get polished up on your skills. So I guess the other thing is that you always hear people talking about diversification. Now's that time. I can tell you, having seen a lot of appraisers when we go through some of these cycles, think, I think I'm going to diversify, and they start doing work that they're not entirely qualified to do. And they start using, doing things the way they have done for a mortgage lending assignment and find themselves in trouble. So for those of you looking to diversify your practice, make sure you take the time to develop reporting templates that are appropriate for the assignment, because you can certainly find yourself in difficulty if you're not doing those correctly. And you find that sometimes the Fannie Mae guidelines and things that are set forth are not necessarily appropriate in doing other types of non-lending assignments.
Craig, thank you. Wisdom from Mr. Craig Morley, a man who has a lot of it and has sat in enough chairs to get it. So again, Craig, thank you. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you being here and watching this. Please look at some of the other videos that we've got up here and enjoy those as well. So Craig, thank you very much. And to everybody out there, thank you. We'll see you the next time.
Thanks, Tim.